Well, we're going to have a look at this climate crock of the week for this week, and this is the claim that the CO2 rise is man-made. Now I'm going to look at Wiki for these claims, the claims of settled science, because it's all encapsulated in the one place, and because they do reference peer-reviewed literature and the IPCC in many of these claims that I'm going to reference through Wiki. And I would say that a lot of the claims are falsifiable, and even though they claim 100% that this is settled science, they could be wrong. The first one here is, what is the first claim? The Industrial Revolution has caused a dramatic rise in CO2. Here we have another one. The present concentration is the highest in the past 800,000 years. Is that true? We'll check it. The next one, the current concentration of CO2 may be the highest in 20 million years. So now they're being a little bit careful, saying maybe. They're not so certain about that one. Now the next claim of settled science is that global warming is attributed primarily to increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration. So they're not only saying that we are responsible for the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, they are saying that global warming, which I guess they're defining as the modern period of global warming in the 20th century, is our fault. That's what they're saying. The next claim is that carbon dioxide has unique long-term effects on climate change that are largely irreversible for 1,000 years after the emissions stop. It seems to be a pretty wild claim, considering that the CO2 residence time is around 5 years. And here's another claim. Human greenhouse gases have 20 times more effect on the climate system than solar changes. That also seems to me to be a pretty wild claim, but it's in the IPCC's AR4 and AR5. We will check all these claims against the scientific evidence. Okay, first we'll just have a look at this graph that you see commonly, which shows the last 800,000 years of a CO2 proxy. That is the ice core proxy. And spliced on the end, basically we have the last 60 years or so. That is the instrumental data from Mauna Loa since 1958. Is it a good idea to splice together a proxy record with real instrumental measurements? Well, I'm not so sure about that, but the two are not directly comparable. It's like putting apples and oranges together. Now, what can we say about this ice core proxy record? Is it correct? Is it true that CO2 concentration in the atmosphere never went above 300 parts per million for the last 800,000 years? Well, there's a lot of doubt about that, as we'll see. Now in ice cores, to get the proxy temperature record from those, we look at the ice, which is of course made from water. Water has oxygen atoms in it. And there are several isotopes of oxygen, oxygen 18, oxygen 16 we're concerned with here, and it's the ratio between those two that give us some idea of the temperature at the time. That gives us a proxy inference. We can infer the temperature from the ratios between those two isotopes. Now it's not the same with CO2. With CO2 we collect the CO2 from bubbles in the ice. And the thinking is that that is an exact sample from the original atmosphere at the time when the snow fell. So the CO2 is directly measured. Now I'm just showing you the results from the IPCC ice dome record. Proxy record comparing temperature and CO2, temperature from the oxygen isotope ratios, and it clearly shows that CO2 lags temperature changes. So we know from this that there's an approximate 800-year lag between a temperature change and a CO2 change. So CO2 basically is known to be controlled by temperature changes in the historical proxy record. So no causative effect from CO2 to temperatures is seen in this ice core record. Now we'll move forward and look at the more recent period, the last 10,000 years, that of the Holocene. Holocene interglacial, and here we've got the GISP2 temperature proxy from Greenland, and below that we've got the IPCC Dome Sea ice core, which is showing a slight increase in CO2 from 260 to 280 part per million over the period of the record, while temperatures were slowly falling in the GISP2 temperature proxy record. Now you could even say from this that the Antarctic and the Arctic go in opposite directions to some degree. That is, when the Arctic is warming, as you see there, from 11,000 to say 7,000 years before present, the Antarctic was cooling, as you can see from the CO2 record, and vice versa. When from 7,000 years ago, in the Antarctic record, at the bottom, the CO2 record, is when the CO2 is rising from 7,000 years before present to the present, the opposite was happening in Greenland. It was cooling, long-term cooling trend. And we'll come back to this in future videos because it's extremely important. This is one of the clues. It's actually the canary in the coal mine that tells you that the CO2 theory, that CO2 drives climate change, is wrong, and that there is another factor involved. That is that clouds drive climate change, not CO2. We'll come back to that. Now the CO2 record does appear very monotonic, hardly changing, which when you look at the wild swings in temperature, you wonder why that is happening. So what we really need to do is, as scientists, we need to check the CO2 ice proxy record with other proxy records for CO2 and just see the differences, compare different other proxy records. Now here we've got the stomatal record from fossil needles on Mount Rainier. This is work by Cohenberg in his PhD thesis from 2004. And it shows something quite interesting happening with CO2, which you don't see from the ice core record, which, as I said, are very monotonic. Very flat, just below 300 parts per million there, right through the record over the last 2,000 years in the ice core record for CO2. But something very different in the stomatal record from fossil needles. Stomata, plant stomata, are just like little breathing holes, I'd say, on the surface of leaves. All plants have them. And depending on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, that determines the size of the stomata and the quantity of the stomata. So you can tell from the size and quantity of the stomata just what the concentration of CO2 was in the atmosphere. Okay, it's a very exact correlation between the two. You can see here there's a peak around 400 AD specifically, at around 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, which is similar to today's levels. Today's supposedly alarming records that levels that we haven't seen for tens of millions of years. But there they are, less than 2,000 years ago we had 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere according to the plant stomata proxies. So we need to look into this further. Now, one question we might ask is what happened in 400 AD in regards to global temperatures? If we look at proxy temperature records, what do we find? Let's look at one paper in the literature, which is Yu et al. From 2011. Now, what they did is they looked at the climate records through tree rings. They used proxy tree rings from the Tibetan Plateau. And this is the temperature record they found from the Tibetan Plateau in the Himalayas. Notice the massive peak in 400 AD, 1600 years ago. Massive peak in temperatures. Actually, the temperature in the 50 years around that time rose dramatically, more than 1.5 degrees centigrade in the Tibetan Plateau. Was that associated with a global temperature peak? And is that related to the massive peak in CO2 we saw in the pine needle stomata for CO2, where it touched 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere? Now, Yu et al. Found a lot of cycles, a lot of climate cycles in our data, very many of them. One of the most prominent ones was the 1324-year cycle associated with solar activity, as you see here. 600 years of decline and 600 years of temperatures going up. So, pretty common cycle, which says that in effect we've probably got another couple of hundred years of rising temperatures. But you also said that in the interim, 2006 has been the peak of temperature, and we should expect, due to solar activity reasons, a sharp drop in temperatures down to a low, probably peaking about 2068. So for the next 50 years we should see sharply declining temperatures globally. Now there's a couple of things we're sort of attacking with this data, and that is the idea of a hockey stick, that the temperatures have been steady for 1,000 or more years. That is complete nonsense. And we can see from various work by various papers from people all over the planet, in different parts of the world, that temperatures have varied widely and in concert with each other and in concert with CO2 over centuries, millennia, and even over millions of years. But CO2 has not been the driver. Temperature has been the driver of CO2. And we know also from the stomata results and chemical measurements that we'll go into shortly, that the monotonic ice core record of CO2 gives a base level, but any variations, large variations, generally much higher variations than are shown in the ice core record for CO2 are missing. Now here work by Wagner et al. Has discovered a deep cooling event in the CO2 record around about 8,200 years before present, or 6,200 BC if you like. And this is also apparent in the GISP2 record from Greenland. Very deep descent down and cooling there about 8,200 years before present. Now you have to note especially here that the CO2 ice proxy record does not show any such dip. It's only in the plant stomata record where you see the dip in CO2. So these are things you have to look for. Different authors, different papers, and things that correlate with each other. Temperatures correlating with CO2 changes and so on. This is what really helps us to determine which proxy record is correct, the ice core record or the plant stomata record. Okay, now what I'm showing you now is the CO2 record. This is another proxy, dwarf birch stomata. Now this is work by Steins, Hartz, Dotter et al. Published in 2013. Now this covers the very deep cooling of the Younger Dryas, which occurred between roughly 11,500 to 12,800 years before present. It's clearly shown here. It comes up very clearly in the stomata proxy. And just before the Younger Dryas, you can see that the proxy is showing 400 to 450 parts per million CO2. And then a sudden descent down during the Younger Dryas to around 200 parts per million CO2. That is a considerable change. And very, very clear in this proxy record. And here we can see a comparison between this dwarf birch plant stomata data and the ice core record. There's a considerable difference in the variation. Now the problems with the CO2 data from the ice core record, it's related to the Knudsen diffusion effect. When the ice forms from the snow, which gets compacted into firn, you eventually get a pressure of 320 bar within the ice core. And what this does in effect is it minimizes variations. It reduces the maximums for CO2 measurements. So the ice core CO2 record is not reliable, well, apart from just as a base giving generalized direction of CO2 over very long periods. And you're not going to get any localized or short-term variations, and you're going to miss all the peaks basically. Now, if you remember, we started with 6 questions, which were supposed to be settled science in quotes from WIKI. Now, I'd say that question 2. Present concentration is the highest in the past 800,000 years. Well, we've dealt with that. That's pretty well unlikely. The other proxies apart from the ice core proxies. And the third claim, the current concentration of CO2 may be the highest in 20 million years. Well, we can probably throw that out as well. Now, there still seems to be a lot of people pushing this hockey stick nonsense and believing in it, that Michael Mann's hockey stick is still correct, and it's even been confirmed by other work. Well, it's total tripe. We can easily disprove that the temperature's hardly been changed for thousands of years. It's nonsense. We only have to look at the tree lines. There's been a lot of work done on this in Finland and also in Siberia. So the tree lines were much further north during the medieval, the Minoan periods. So that's quite clear from the data. We can see that tree lines between 10,000 and 3,000 years before present were further north than they are now. So it was definitely warmer in the earlier Holocene. And even in later periods, such as the medieval and Minoan periods and the Roman warming period, Those are all quite real and are very clear and visible in the data. Now we also know from historical records, from books, from paintings over the last 1,000 years or so that the climate has changed dramatically from the very warm medieval warm period when church building took place, cathedral building across Europe. Greenland was settled, grapes were growing in the north of England and York, and to the depths of the Little Ice Age at the end of the 17th century when the Thames froze solid and ice fairs were held on the Thames. So we know 100% for certain that the hockey stick, as invented by man, is a fraud. Well, now we'll go back to the first question, which is supposedly settled science as well. The Industrial Revolution has caused a dramatic rise in CO2. Okay, everyone seems to believe that today. Well, let's use a graph from our old friends over there at Skeptical Science. I think they need a bit of a helping hand, because with their hypothesis collapsing around their ears day by day. Now what they've got here is, of course, the monotonic ice core CO2 record in blue there along the bottom, dragging along the bottom, no variation whatever. As we've seen, that's incorrect. Anyway, they've tagged onto that the low dome ice core and, of course, the instrumental record from Mauna Loa in Hawaii in red. So we've got yet another hockey stick. Of course, this whole idea that the Industrial Revolution has caused a dramatic rise in CO2 since the Industrial Revolution started probably 1750 is all tied up to the monotonic ice core record for CO2. If that doesn't exist, the whole house of cards collapses. I don't know what it is with these guys with their hockey sticks. They seem to love them, but we're certainly going to get rid of a few of them today. So let's examine this claim, this settled science that, quote, the Industrial Revolution has caused a dramatic rise in CO2, unquote. Well, just have a look at this little table here. It's a bit out of date now, but anyway, it's still applicable. Except that from 1998 onwards to now, we've probably not had 25% of total human emissions, anthropogenic CO2 emissions, but probably 35% now. In any event, we know that the part of our emissions emitted prior to 1850 is less than 1%, and that still holds now. So just bear that in mind while we look at another graph. Now this graph shows the low dome ice core CO2 versus the anthropogenic emissions of CO2 that we've just looked at. Now the problem here for the alarmists is that the CO2 started going up in 1750, long before we started to emit hardly any CO2. So the actual rate of increase of CO2 is going up at 10 times the rate of the cumulative anthropogenic emissions. That is a big problem for the CAGW proponents or adherents. Now this period even falls within the earliest instrumental temperature record we have, that of the Central England temperature record. And what was the steepest rise within that period, since they started recording temperatures in the 1650s? Well, it was 1770 to 1870. These are the winter temperatures in central England, which went up 1.5 degrees centigrade in that 100 years, which was much greater than the rise and the relatively small rise in the 20th century, which was half that amount. Now, just to repeat, we know that the anthropogenic CO2 emissions were too small up until 1870 to have caused anything like that rise. So that 1.5 degree rise in 100 years was not anthropogenic. Okay, we'll just go through a few of the facts that will make us stop and think about this whole CO2 is dangerous idea. This is the anthropogenic CO2. Someone made this map, trying to map out the world's sources of anthropogenic CO2 emissions. It's not a satellite picture. As you can see, it's east coast of the USA, Europe, India, China and Japan. The rest of the world is pretty well missing. Now, when you look at an actual satellite picture like this one, which is made by the WIKI detector for CO2, which is carried on the Envisat satellite. This is a paper by Buchwitz in 2005, and it shows the actual CO2 concentrations across the world measured by satellite. There's no relation, they bear no relationship to the anthropogenic CO2 emissions, as you can see. Where CO2 emissions actually come from, and most of them, is from the Amazon basin, South America, central regions of Africa. Nothing much in USA or Europe or Russia, and few spatchy bots in Asia and China and Southeast Asia. Nothing really in China or China's east coast or in India. This tells us that, and we know that 96% of all CO2 emissions are natural emissions, coming from the oceans, coming from plant litter that's breaking down. Well, I'm going to reference Skeptical Science again, that well-trusted website, because even they say that anthropogenic CO2 emissions are only 3.7% of natural CO2 emissions. Now I'm going to reference some work done by the CSIRO, namely Donahue et al. 2013. Now this shows that the rising CO2 in the atmosphere has had a strong fertilization effect on foliage cover across the globe, increasing it by at least 11%. This is the greening of the planet that we're hearing a lot about. Well, you might well ask, if it wasn't CO2, what caused the 20th century warming? Well, there's a lot of ideas about this. One is CFCs, which correlate far better with the warming and cooling we've seen than CO2 ever does, or the solar activity. In particular, solar activity. Now, just like CO2 needs a mechanism to amplify it, to cause any slight warming it may cause to become alarming, then the solar activity also needs a mechanism, and it's through the cosmic ray flux associated with clouds. We can see how this cloud mechanism works here. We have tropical cloud cover dropping from 66% to 60% in the period 1984 to 1998. That's quite a large drop, and it caused approximately a 0.5 degree increase in global temperatures. And then there's another effect which hasn't been taken into account, and that is the PDO. PDO, of course, cycle is driven by the sun, and this is generally approximately 30 years cycle up or 30 years down. And what the so-called climate scientists did in the 70s and early 80s is they mistook the rise in the 80s and the 90s for CO2. They correlated that with the rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, assumed that that rise in CO2 in the atmosphere was anthropogenic, put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5. Since then, we've realised, of course, that they were quite wrong and that the rise in CO2 has kept going, mostly a natural rise because of the ocean heating, delayed reaction from the ocean heating that we had in the 20th century. And since 1998, we've had nothing but stable temperatures or even slightly falling temperatures on some data sets such as RSS MSU, and the other data sets there's a very slight rise. But anyway, no statistically significant change since 1998. And if you ignore the 1991 Pinatubo cooling, which was about 0.3 to 0.4 degrees centigrade, then there's been no statistically significant change since 1990. 25 years. That's longer than the so-called global warming period from the mid-70s to the late 80s. And there's other things that make us think that the CO2 is driving the climate stuff is nonsense. For CO2 to drive the climate, it has to make a greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect makes a hotspot, or supposedly makes a hotspot, according to all the theory and all the modelling, at a height of about 10 kilometers across the tropics, and warms the North Pole and the South Pole. Well, none of that, except a slight warming in the North Pole. None of the rest has happened. There's no hotspot. In fact, there's a cooling at 10 kilometers over the equator, and there's been no warming in Antarctica, and only a very slight warming at in the Arctic. So the observations diverge dramatically from the models and from theory, the CO2 theory. Similarly, work by Humlum, Stordal, Solheim in 2012. They found that CO2 changes in the 20th century and early 21st century are directly related to changes in ocean temperatures. So it's the CO2 concentrations and changes in the atmosphere are determined by the ocean changes, ocean temperature changes, and how the ocean temperature is going up and down. So there's no correlation at all with anthropogenic emissions. That's quite clear from what they showed, from their work. One interesting thing that Humlum et al. Found was that the origin of the CO2 changes comes from the southern hemisphere, mid-latitudes, not from the northern hemisphere where most 95% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions originate. So the changes in CO2 have nothing to do with anthropogenic emissions. And again, if we look at this graph here, which shows the high feedbacks that are supposedly existing, which give us the dangerous warming over the next century of 3 degrees plus or minus 1.5. This all started with Charney et al. In 1979. The 3 degrees plus or minus 1.5, which has been used ever since by the IPCC, Hansen and all these alarmists, has no basis. In fact, there's no reason behind it except that's the end result of their modelling. So just to recap, we can probably scrub a couple of more of these settled science claims from WIKI. The Industrial Revolution has caused a dramatic rise in CO2, and the global warming is attributed primarily to increasing atmospheric CO2 concentrations. They can be scrubbed. Which brings us to number 5. Carbon dioxide has unique long-term effects on climate change that are largely irreversible for 1,000 years after emissions stop. Why not 1,000,000 years? Now the IPCC give various different numbers for the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere. Pretty confused. One place they've got 4 years in the IPCC report text. Other places they've got 20 years, 50 years, 200 years. So pretty confused picture. But the carbon dioxide residence time is probably between 5 and 15 years, according to the latest research. Which brings us to our last little WIKI settled science claim. Claim number 6. Human greenhouse gases have 20 times more effect on the climate system than solar changes. Notice what it says. Human greenhouse gases have 20 times more effect on the climate than solar changes. Now this is lifted straight from the IPCC. Now here's the graph from the AR5, the latest report released in 2013 from the IPCC. It shows the relative radiative forcing on the climate system, and all those up the top are anthropogenic. And this little one down here, that is the changes in solar irradiance. That's all they count as far as the sun goes. Actually, if you count up the anthropogenic greenhouse gas forcing, it comes to 3.18 watts per square metre over the period 1750 to today. And they estimate the solar forcing at 0.05 watts per square metre. And if you divide one by the other, you end up with 63.6 times. So their estimate of 20 times is wrong. They're actually claiming that human greenhouse gases force the climate more, 63.6 times more, than solar changes do. So there we are, it's down in black and white. The IPCC bureaucrats say that we humans are 63 times more powerful than the sun at controlling the Earth's climate. Here's a picture for you to look at, just so you can see the size difference between the Earth and the sun. The Earth is one of the smallest of the planets, and it is 1.3 million times smaller than the sun in volume. I'll leave it to you whether you think it's the sun or us that controls the climate. Now here's a TSI reconstruction by Shapiro 2011. This might give you some idea where the IPCC got its ridiculous 0.05 watts per square metre forcing of the TSI since 1750. They've cherry-picked a high in the record for a start, which is roughly equal to what we've got now as far as TSI goes. Any normal person would have chosen the low in the record, the bottom of the little ice age to go from, which was 1690, and would have seen an increase of 7 watts per square metre instead of 0.05. Even if we stick to the date of 1750 and we use Dr. Judith Lean's TSI reconstruction from the year 2000. Now Judith Lean, for a long time, for many years, was the only solar physicist that the IPCC used. And if we look at the TSI that she has for 1750, 1364.5, and the current 1366.5, that's 2 watts per square metre. Divide that by 4, of course, because of the shape of the Earth. You still get 0.5 watts per square metre, which is 10 times the IPCC's AR5 estimate for TSI changes since 1750. You know, it's highly surprising the IPCC got the results they'd have, because if you use one solar specialist out of 2,000 scientists that you're using, they're not going to have much input, are they? I mean, for a start, the sun is more than just TSI. You've got solar activity, and that solar activity is known to be correlated with cosmic ray changes on the ground here, and those are correlated to changes in cloud properties. So all this is interconnected. So to claim to cherry pick a peak in TSI in 1750 and then say, well, there's been no change in the sun as far as forcing goes, you're ignoring the solar mechanisms that are involved, while at the same time you're taking into account hypothesized CO2 mechanisms that might not exist, such as the positive water vapor feedback, which there's no evidence whatever for. So it's just generally a lot of misinformation, ignoring science, and cherry picking what you want to get the result that you want. Here we have the sun climate link expressed through clouds and cosmic rays. We can see that over the last 100 years or so there's been a strong decrease in galactic cosmic ray flux. This is beryllium-10 proxy, cosmic ray proxy from the ice core in Greenland. Now, unlike the CO2 catastrophic anthropogenic global warming hypothesis, there is a lot of scientific evidence behind the galactic cosmic ray, solar activity, clouds, and Earth climate links. Here we have the galactic cosmic ray cloud link, which has been clearly revealed during Forbush decreases. That's when we get CMEs coming out from the sun, coronal mass ejections, some that are not exactly directed at Earth but in our general direction. We will get a Forbush decrease. Now, Scott Forbush discovered this effect. He found that when there was a CME on the sun or some large eruption, it causes a sudden reduction of about 10% in the cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth. Now, this results in a reduction in cloud cover. Less cosmic rays reaching the Earth, less clouds, and that is what's seen during a Forbush decrease. The muon flux decreases substantially, along with the cosmic ray flux, because the highly powered muons that reach the troposphere originate from powerful cosmic rays. So when you boil it all down, not only doesn't our CO2 control the climate, but CO2 itself doesn't control the climate. What does is clouds. So human CO2 is irrelevant. What drives the climate system is clouds. Clouds take their instructions from the cosmic ray flux. The cosmic ray flux is modulated on short time scales by solar activity and on longer time scales by our position in the Milky Way.